Meet people as they arrive. Yeah. Okay. Going to just say welcome to everybody. I'm still amazed by the level of attendance that we get at Youth Justice Board seminars. My name's Neil Rhodes, and I'm a member of the Youth Justice Board, and I've got a special interest in serious youth violence. So this is of particular importance to me. It's absolutely fantastic that we've had 250 people register for this event, and people are still sort of landing thick and fast in our lobby entry, and you are most welcome. I looked at the list of attendees and I could see that it's familiar territory for many of you. But for those of you who haven't been to our seminars before, I'd just say welcome. Please come again. It's a brilliant, cheap, accessible way to meet and listen to fellow professionals in this field and pick up on best practice. And we've just been astounded by the level of interest that there has been. We decided that as part of our strategic aim to help reduce youth violence back in 2019, to fund a group of yachts to act as pathfinders. One of the very first potential pathfinders who beat a path to our door was the team from Manchester, who are going to talk to us, and they were part of the original reference group of pathfinders. We granted Manchester funding for a research-based project into a study exploring young people's experiences of youth justice practice around serious youth violence, working out how best to work with them and how best to reduce instances of serious youth violence. And we're particularly interested in their proposition around adverse childhood experiences and about understanding the child's perception of that and their articulation of what they thought were the causes. It's brilliant today to have with us such a strong team. We've got Marie McLaughlin, the head of Youth Justice at Manchester, team manager Tom Lang, and then we've got Dr. Paul Gray, Dr. Deborah Jump, and Professor Hannah Smithson from the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies from Manchester Metropolitan University. We really appreciate your attendance, folks, and we're looking forward enormously today. What I would just say on a housekeeping issue as we move forward, and in a second I'm going to hand over to Marie, is there's a chat line going alongside this, just like normal teams. Please chip in there and share your comments, your thoughts, your questions as you're going through. We'll be doing our best to monitor that and to pick up on those. If you can, please keep your microphones on mute, because every now and then we do get some feedback or we get somebody's mobile phone ringing in the background. And with 100+ people attending the call, that's a bit hard for us to manage. But most of all, engage today and share your views. Use that chat line, and I hope you get a lot out of it. We've had a lot of people wanting to register after the registration had completely filled up, and we got 250 takers. If there remains continuing support, we're going to talk to the Manchester team about possibly doing another event, possibly in the middle of June. So as I say, just put your comments, your thoughts in that chat line. Marie, with no more ado, thank you ever so much, and over to you. We're really looking forward to this session.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everybody to today. We've been looking forward to this for some time. It's great in terms of the Pathfinder to be at this stage, and we are excited by the research which you're going to hear about. I'm only going to say a couple of words, really. I'll be very brief. But what I did want to say is a bit about Manchester, so please bear with me. Manchester is continually vying with another core city for top place in the National League table of the number of serious youth violent offences. It's a league table we'd prefer not to be in. This year, 2020, like most other areas, we did see a significant reduction in levels of serious youth violence, 63% in Manchester. But it doesn't feel like there's been a drop in serious youth violence from what we're seeing. In 2020, we lost 2 young men in 2 separate incidents. They lost their lives as a result of stabbings in the city. And we've seen many other victims of knife, machete, and other violent offences. And we've supervised and supported victims and perpetrators, as you will have as well. The understanding why serious youth violence takes place is key to addressing it effectively. And this is why, with the help of the YJB, we commissioned the research from Youth Studies Department in MMU, Manchester. And we hope that you find it as interesting and as useful as we do. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Paul Gray, who led the research for us. Paul, over to you.
Hi, thanks Neil, thanks Marie. Let me just share the screen and hopefully has that worked, people?
Yes.
Right, yes, good afternoon. Welcome everybody. As Neil and Marie have talked about, we're going to present the findings from our research study that we've just completed. I've seen a few comments in the chat around whether the slides will be available, and I've just sent a PDF of the slides and also a PDF of this final research report to the YJB team so they can circulate it to those of you who have attended. But yeah, the webinar is going to summarise the findings from this piece of research. Obviously, we can't do justice to the research in the time we've got, so we're going to try and kind of skim through what we think are the main points. And if anybody wants to look at it in more detail, like I say, that link takes you to the report, but I've also sent the report to the YJ team to disseminate. So we're going to just give a brief introduction to the research. We're going to outline the methodological approaches that we adopted. We adopted a range of methods. I'm just going to summarise the main findings, and then we're just going to touch on the key recommendations that came out of the research. And so I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Deborah.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, as the report will demonstrate, which we'll share later on, it's starting to emerge that there's significant evidence of ACEs in serious youth violence cases. Basically, a child's loss is a young person's violence, and what first presents as a perpetrator slowly uncovers a victim. Throughout this presentation, you will see that we are advocating for kind of a structural overhaul of the sector if we want to take trauma-informed approaches more seriously. ACEs are starting to become part of the mainstream conversation, and this is a really good thing, particularly when we look at the economic and social cost of SYV in England, as shown on the slide. What we do need to consider with this mainstream conversation is that we can scaffold staff and young people to work through traumatic narratives that we're seeing more and more young people presenting with. And as Marie has discussed, the SYV offences in Manchester have risen by over 200%. So this is something that we need to consider, and it's such a pertinent issue for the UK as a whole. Next slide, Paul. So for those of you, anyone who works in youth justice at the moment will have come across the term ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And there's 3 main types according to the CDC, which everyone will be familiar with. It's the Centre for Disease Control with the COVID crisis. And these aren't exhaustive, these 3 types, abuse, neglect and environmental factors. And throughout our research, we saw incidences of all 3. And we're starting to slowly, or the evidence is starting to slowly emerge that ACEs have long-lasting negative effects on health, well-being and opportunity. So in some respects, they're straddling these biopsychosocial models that are actually becoming more and more apparent in criminology and youth justice. There's also a lot of evidence in public health to suggest that ACEs can reduce overall life expectancy. So while it is difficult to draw firm conclusions around causality, correlation does not equal causality, i.e. ACEs equal SYV. There is very strong likelihood from emerging data across many, many realms that there is a relationship between ACEs and future entry into the criminal justice system, youth justice system, and child and adolescent mental health services. I think more work needs to be done on the gender variable. So when we're dealing with children, we need to look at the gender variable across both male and female, because the evidence from this report is mainly male-centric, and it'd be interesting to look at how different ACEs relate to gender. That's an aside, and maybe some future research that we can look at. But what's more important, I think, when we cover it in slide 5, please, Paul, is what do we mean by trauma-informed? So being trauma-informed means recognising and acknowledging the impact that this can have and providing appropriate support to that person. I think for me, in its simplest terms, it means working with young people to help them make a connection between what they feel and what they do. If this can be achieved, according to a lot of recent psychotherapeutic literature in child psychiatry, then it is possible to reduce the enactment of violence. It takes time, but there's evidence to suggest that this can be done. Because what happens with serious youth violence is that the acting out of the violence is usually a mechanism in which the young people are using the violence to dispel the traumatic events. In other words, arguably, the violence we are witnessing is in response to some cognitive traumatic blueprint that they've created as a defense mechanism in childhood against that particularly adverse childhood event. And more in child psychiatry and these psychosocial approaches, it's as a result of poor attachment styles, a lack of primary attachment figures. And this is compounded by an environmental acceptance of violence, either at the familial or the community level. So going back to these psychosocial approaches are fundamental here. And throughout the recommendations, we'll talk about how that kind of comes into practice in youth justice. So interesting, what you will see throughout the report and this presentation is that the reasons for violence or carrying a knife, which as we know are a bladed article, is really high, is in response to a perceived threat, either psychologically or environmentally. And this is slowly starting to emerge in the evidence around adverse childhood events. But for me, when we look at this and the design of services and the impact that trauma can have, is that this trauma-informed approach can't become a buzzword for disaster capitalism. And practitioners and policymakers need to consider the level at which they pitch their intervention and support. So therapy and any kind of therapeutic support to both staff and young people needs to be seen as support and not part of the punishment. And trauma reform needs to be wide-ranging across the sector, including police and courts, as highlighted in the report. So slide 6, please, Paul. What we tried to do is consider this in the Manchester approach. And if you know Manchester, you'll know that we are known for participatory youth practice, which Tom is going to talk to you about more in a sec. And it's really welcoming to see the YJB business plan that states that the experience of the child and the voice is paramount in all that we do. And that's fundamental to us in Manchester. I think it's important that we just don't uncover all these ACEs and then what? And this is where PYP and Child First comes in. Because by including young people in the discussion and providing stable and consistent attachment figures via yacht staff, we can offer this consistency and certainty that the evidence is asking for, alongside more structurable, tangible opportunities such as employment and education. And this is built on psychosocial and psychotherapeutic evidence that suggests that this consistency through trusted adults can develop self-reflection in young people and move them to a place whereby they can challenge their own thinking. And you can only do that if you involve young people in the conversation. If you can challenge their thinking around negative events and these destructive cognitive blueprints, then you can start to unpick some of the mechanisms by which violence is enacted and rehearsed. So participatory practices are the first approach, and Tom's going to talk you through those a little bit more now. So over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Deb. That's a tough act to follow, isn't it? Brilliant. So, hi, I'm Tom Lang, and I'm a team manager in Manchester Youth Justice, and take a lead on sort of developing participation and co-production within the service, as well as implementing arts-based interventions. And you know, it's been great working on this project with Marie, Hannah, and Paul, and Deb. So now I'm going to use this brief slot to give you a flavour about what Manchester Youth Justice is all about, and what research looks like in practice, and more importantly, how this research on PYP improves outcomes for young people. So, got my timer on. So, Paul, thanks. What you can see in front of you now is our practice model. Right. This is our identity. This is how we articulate to our partners across Manchester what it is we actually do in youth justice. We don't just write reports and breach young people. You know, we actually what we design and deliver for young people is very intricate and personalised. And you can see that the Manchester Youth Justice were a forward-thinking, relationship-focused service who were committed to developing practice and trying new ways of working. And co-production is an increasing theme throughout all aspects of all our practice we do. So our children, they're often the most underserved in society, children in the youth justice system. And in Manchester, for example, 43% of children in Manchester live in poverty. So through PYP, we train our staff to look at assessments and interventions through the lens of each individual child in order to promote optimism and hope. You know, this is real strength-based interventions, and as you can see by our core principles, which was designed in consultation with young people and staff, is trust, participation, and change. Now, as I said, this underpins what we do. This is our identity, and it articulates the depth of what we do. Now, with regards to trusted relationships, you know, the relationship is the intervention. The rest are tools, additions to the intervention. And for a true strength-based attitudes and interventions within the service, we insist that we always see the child first, and the child never defined by their risks or their behaviours. And when we're looking at our young person, our assessments, we need to articulate and accept what are the consequences for this child if we are to fail them. This is the mindset we try and promote in Manchester. So in order for a child to participate, and develop a trusting relationship, and to actually participate in what another system which is being imposed upon them, it needs to feel legitimate. That the relationship needs to be trusted, it needs to be real, and because without legitimacy, the meaning of any intervention for children is lost. Now, how many children have you worked with, or you aware of, who have been on a negative trajectory, even when things like child in need, child protection, school exclusions, and going to the fruit, and you continue on that negative trajectory into the criminal justice system? That's because they're not allowed to participate in the decisions which are being made for them and about them, right? And when the legitimacy is lost, the meaning is lost. And we develop trust with our young people. And it's on the basis that any successful intervention has to be meaningful, based on trust and reciprocity, so that children feel free to ask questions, seek support. But we're also, it's key to have trust with partners, you know, because the child is at the centre of the multi-agency approach, and it's important that we all work holistically together. Now, with regards to participation, I'm going to show you a separate slide on participation and how we've developed a framework. But in Manchester, it's the way that we do things, and it's not just the thing that we do. Okay? And children, you know, they have the fundamental right to contribute to an effective response to their behaviour, and I'll explain that in the framework. And then the change aspect of our work. We're ambitious for our children. You know, as I said before, children don't always get a fair offer in society, right? And our children certainly don't get a fair offer in society. And it's a crying shame that they have to come into the criminal justice system to receive specialist targeted support, and to have somebody who's committed to developing a relationship with them. And due to the traumatised children I'm talking about, And what we do with regards to change is we teach children how to problem solve in future challenging and conflicting situations. And we change negative perceptions. We change negative perceptions they have of themselves and the world around them. And we give them the opportunities to realise their ambitions, and to develop a positive future. And we challenge labelling. Right? This is a big thing in our service. One kid told me that if everyone thinks I'm going to go out and rob people just because of the way I look, then it's inevitable that eventually I will. And he did. Now, this child, he didn't need an off-the-shelf intervention focused on consequential thinking and peer pressure. He needed help to realise his positive identity. He needed to see his strengths, and he needed to build his self-esteem and feel like he belongs part of society. And guess what? He's thriving now. His world has revoked, and he's living life, and he's moving on with himself. He's got a new future. So I know stuff like this, but a key principle in Manchester is like we're ambitious for our children, ambitious for them, and we want to smash the ceiling when it comes to getting good outcomes. Now, can you go to the next slide, please, Bob? So this is our participatory youth practice. This is our participation framework, and as you can see, participatory youth practice is an evidence-based, research-informed framework of youth justice practice, and it's developed through co-creation and participatory research with young people in Greater Manchester. Now, in 2017, the children used their lived experiences supported by academic theory in order to formulate this approach and to working with them in the system. And he gave us 8 key principles. I'm not going to read them all out to you. I've contained them 8 key principles within describing the practice model. Now, they are on the next slide, and so is a link to the web address. So you can see on this that participatory youth practice, it underpins everything we do in Manchester Youth Justice. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of assessing, it's a way of planning, and it's a way of problem solving. It's a way of taking children on that journey through intervention and thriving for getting them to thrive and get great outcomes, their outcomes. They take ownership of them. And in order for any service to achieve participatory actualisation, you need a framework like this, or Child First at the basis. It's the way you think and the way you do. And as you can see, for the next stage of our development, it's co-production. Now, I've been in the service 15 years, and I've seen us develop from a prescriptive service. I'm going to tell you what you need to do in order to stop you offending. That approach, that off-the-shelf intervention approach, right? So what we adopt now, what participatory youth practice has enabled us to do is to work with the child, and not deliver interventions to him. And we have a saying, which is, what should we be doing? Let's decide together. And that's the approach we used for the mindset of the staff. So our children, they co-produce their own referral reports, and then they go and present them at the panel. Right? And, it's their version of events. We've done our Asset Plus. It's their version of events. What it does, it enables them to take ownership of the journey they're about to go on, and it gives them ownership and buy-in of that co-designed plan they're at the panel to deliver. And the outcomes are increasingly getting better for young people and referral orders through this method given to we use. And then we look at getting kids to influence the design and delivery of the service. Simple question, if you had the power to change youth justice, what would you do? And what our children told us is they would like they would like Wi-Fi access. We always had it. We never give it them. So we give them Wi-Fi access. They'd like a drink and something to eat, because sometimes they're hungry and thirsty, but they don't want to have to ask because they're ashamed. They would like a nice environment in which to work in, which to come and work with us in. So we give them the project to code to design the rooms to work in. And what they did is they brought the outside in with plants and outdoor features and lighting and comfy chairs and coffee tables. And you know what? Not one coffee table's ever been thrown. And they asked for the environment to be non-threatening. So they don't want to see pictures on the wall like knife crimes about, don't or watch out, chlamydia is going to come and get you. They want to see positive, strength-based aspirational messages and artwork on the walls. And that's what we give them. So the final bit here now is like looking at research. And I don't just mean research like we've done with PYP and research with regards to the serious youth violence and ACEs relationship. But it's about engaging children in topical research. And what I mean by this is engaging children in matters which are prevalent in society, such as Black Lives Matters, Stop and Search, the experience of lockdown, and understanding different cultures and identities. And what we do is you use guided conversations to elicit their experiences, their thoughts, their feelings, more importantly, their ideas. And we use their views to train and challenge society to evoke change at all levels. And you know what? The children love being asked. They love being engaged in this type of work. And if we want solutions to some of the most complex matters affecting children, then it makes sense to ask the experts. Just next slide, Paul. And they are the 8 key principles, and that's just a little oversight of Manchester Youth Justice. Over to you, Paul.
Right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so just to bring it back to the research report itself, the project had 5 main objectives. We wanted to kind of gauge the nature and the prevalence of ACEs among justice-involved children in Manchester. There's been a real dearth of research that's looked at ACEs. There was stuff by Gwyneth Boswell in the 1990s with Section 53 offenders in custody. Then there was something in 2010 by the Prison Reform Trust, again, of a couple of hundred young people in custody. So we wanted to try and get an update, kind of measure of the prevalence of ACEs amongst justice-involved children. And then related to what Tom was saying there, we wanted to explore, children's own views on the causes and the drivers of SUV, their experiences of working with youth justice and trauma-informed practice, and to try and unpick the complex relationship between ACEs and SYV. And then also ultimately, and this is something that we're going to show in the webinar today, to co-create a resource that could be used to support work with justice-involved children. In terms of the design itself, we were a little bit hampered by COVID, as everybody was. So the project ran over a little bit and we had to change our methodology. But the 4 main elements of the project were to kind of have an ACEs assessment tool. And this was a kind of revised version of the tool that was used in the 1990s ACEs study in America in Southern California. We interviewed workers, semi-structured interviews remotely, obviously because of COVID. And then we youth justice workers undertook narrative kind of life interviews with justice-involved children on their caseload. And the 4th and final part was kind of participatory workshops with justice-involved children. And this is where we created that the output that you're going to see in a minute. In terms of the ACEs assessment tool, this was the version that we created based on that Felitti study. Over the course of last year, 200 young people were assessed using this tool, and that was just under half of all open cases during that period. So cases that had been open prior to the 11th of Jan 2020, and new cases that started after the January 2020. And this was completed by workers on behalf of the children on their caseload. In fact, Tom, do you want to just give a brief description of how this worked in practice?
Yeah. I think what it was is like when we're reading assessments and reports, we see and we describe children's lived experience in ACEs, but we never had the sort of the data to back it up. So officers would either complete this after they've done an assessment, or what more importantly, become more useful when we were facing barriers such as non-engagement or very hard to reach young people, and you sat in CPF or risk management meetings and everybody's talking negatively about a young person, and you get everyone to engage in this process of scoring the ACEs. And actually people took a totally different take to it, actually started thinking strength-based and support-based rather than complaining about the difficulties engaging the young people. And it's also a very good method to be using in supervision to have a different type of conversation.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, just crucially, it was a live document. So as relationships kind of built up and workers got to know children more, the document could be updated over time. So it wasn't just a single snapshot at initial assessment or anything. We interviewed 10 youth justice workers and 2 therapists from an emotional support team that the Manchester Youth Justice Service have commissioned to deliver clinical interventions with children. We were going to do narrative interviews ourselves, but because of the COVID restrictions, this wasn't possible. So instead, we trained some youth justice workers to deliver these interviews on our behalf using the McAdams life story approach. And yeah, there was a real appetite amongst workers for this training because there was a view that it could actually help to inform their daily practice themselves. Unfortunately, due to the COVID restrictions that meant remote working and the nature of the live story narrative approach in terms of recording the interviews, there was a limited take-up of children. But during from July to January, we managed to interview 9 people, or youth justice workers managed to interview 9 people. And then the fourth and final part is the participatory workshops that I think Hannah's going to speak to you about.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So the participatory workshops are very much based on the approach that we've been working with the Manchester team on for quite a few years now in terms of participation with children and co-creation with children. So again, just having to have kind of COVID in the context here, we really had to adapt what we wanted to do with the children during this project. But we're really pleased to be able to say that we still manage some face-to-face group work with the children. So with our youth justice colleagues from the Manchester team, we identified and subsequently invited children who at the time of this particular project were working with the team for SYV offences. We worked very closely with 3 drama therapists from One Education, as Paul has said, who were commissioned by the Manchester Youth Justice Services. And we also worked with a professional sports coach from the university. And I can't drama therapists and the sports coach. So the drama therapy element of the first and second workshops that we ran face-to-face with children. So they came to the university to a COVID secure building, which was actually a sports hall, which obviously lent itself very well to the sporting activities. So the drama therapists often use storytelling as a technique in their work anyway. And given the sensitive nature of the research, we decided to work with the drama therapists and use storytelling techniques in the participatory workshops. And this is specifically a technique called the 6-part story method. And I'll just shorten that to the 6PSM. And it's an approach in which a patient, usually in a health setting, in a therapeutic setting, creates a story which is used to elicit further discussion around something that is obviously relevant to them. So storytelling in this respect, it's really viewed as an effective approach to concentrate on a fictional third-person account. And people would provide metaphors rather than a full description of actual lived events. So this is what we did with the children in the workshops. Paul, can I have the next slide, please? Oh, is it coming? It's all right, I can carry on anyway. So the 6-part story method involves a main character in some setting, a task for the main character, an obstacle that's in that main character's way, things that might help the main character, the climax or main action of the story, and the consequences or aftermath of the story. So this is what the children did in the workshops. And I think it's really important to say at this point that as the research team, we would not have embarked on this particular approach had we not worked with the therapists. We are not clinically trained practitioners. It would have been irresponsible and damaging for the children and potentially for us to have done this without the support of our clinically trained colleagues. So we had in total 2 workshops, 7 young people attended, 5 in the first workshop, 2 in the second. As always, we'd invited many more children, but you know, it's completely up to them as to whether they attended. We also were battling with COVID and so on. So in the first and second workshops, the children actually devised their own stories based on that 6-part storytelling method. We then managed to work with one child who attended the first workshop in and ran a third workshop. We did invite all the children back, but obviously, you know, they've got their own lives. But predominantly, they didn't want to meet on Teams remotely, and that is the only way at that point, because of COVID, that we could actually run a third workshop. So I met with one of the young people from the first workshop, and by then I'd already done some analysis on the main themes that had emerged from the workshop. And what I did was a ranking exercise with this child, and he put in order of importance those themes. So we then took that along with the stories, and we worked with a professional animator over a series of weeks, working very closely to make sure that the children's stories were interpreted exactly as they had told them to us. So what we're going to do now, and this is the first time that we've shown this, and we're so proud of the children who were involved in this. And I would again just like to stress that we have taken literally verbatim their words from the stories that were told to us in these workshops. So what we're going to show now, it's actually it's just under 10 minutes. It's an animation of their stories set to a voiceover, and this is really an output that we would encourage practitioners, policymakers, professionals, children themselves to use in support in sessions around youth violence. So Paul, oh gosh, fingers crossed that this works. This is always the worst bit, isn't it?
Can we see it so far?
I can see it. Can we? I think we're getting a sense that people can.
Yes, I can see it.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Yep.
Jack and Paul. Jack is 16 and has been stabbed 6 times. Twice in the shoulder, 3 times in the leg, and once in the skull. He's found in a local park. Paul is 15 years old and lives in Manchester. He's been tasked with robbing a random by an older. The older has offered him 2k to do it, and Paul is buzzing. It's an opportunity for him to become someone, and if he backs out, he'll lose all credibility and his reputation. Paul accepts the task from the older and agrees to the robbery. It's 9 p.m. in a local park that he's familiar with. Paul doesn't know Jack, but he does know that he will be chilling in the park. The less Paul knows about Jack, the better. Paul is carrying a blade and approaches Jack. He asks for his phone. Jack refuses to hand it over and slaps Paul. Paul wasn't expecting Jack to be a fighter. He retaliates by stabbing him, first in the shoulder, and when Jack fights back, he stabs him again in the leg. Jack still isn't going down, so Paul stabs him in the head. It was one or the other. He had no choice and got paranoid and stabbed him in the head, but only intended to injure him. Paul knows that in these situations, it's kill or be killed. Jack falls to the ground, and a dog walker in the distance sees the fight and calls the feds. The police show up, and Jack gets medical attention. Paul gets to keep his reputation and keep the money, but spends 17 months in pen. Rewind. What could have happened? Paul is carrying a blade and approaches Jack and asks for his phone. Jack refuses to hand it over and slaps Paul. Paul wasn't expecting Jack to be a fighter. A dog walker's nearby and the fight's broken up. Paul and Jack separate and Paul goes back to the older, who has been in the area for ages, and gets a slap and no money. Paul feels wounded when he gets slapped. He feels out of his depth and is worried that he will become irrelevant. He's humiliated. Who is Paul? Paul was a very happy child. Paul sees everything at home as he sits at the top of the stairs. He feels responsible for making his parents happy and can't understand why he doesn't. He feels weak, helpless, and everything is getting worse. Paul goes on to high school, and the transition has made him resilient and stronger. Experiencing these things in the home has been a positive trauma. He feels like the world is shit and he's given up. He stops going to lessons and he comes in late and it affects his learning. He's getting himself involved with smoking weed and hanging out with people. Paul is traumatized by his childhood experiences. He understands trauma to be a shock to the system and a big word for upset. The experience itself was bad. He wasn't ready for it. No one's ready for that. Paul is thinking about his involvement in the fight with Jack. I'm alert all the time. Paul needed someone to understand his background and all the things that he'd experienced. He didn't get any support from school. In the aftermath of the stabbing, Paul received a lot of help from his yacht worker, and they became the person he talked to. Like a friend. Joe's kidnapped. Joe is 15 years old and he's kidnapped by a group of 4 young people, aged between 18 and 21. He's put in the boot of a black Golf that was bought stolen and driven to the moors. Joe is dragged out of the boot and the group batter him. Earlier that day, there are 5 people in the car. James is the one in charge and Liam, his best mate, is in the passenger seat. James and Liam have kidnapped before. They've been best friends since primary school and are now 20 years old. The other 2 in the back seat are randoms. They got paid to do the kidnapping by James and his family. They were picked up from a local shop and have been paid 10k each. The money stakes are high for kidnappings. It's high risk and high reward. They are motivated by the money. James and his family have paid the randoms because they have a problem with Joe. They know that they don't have an option to back out, otherwise they'll be put in the boot. Once they said yes and they're in the car, they don't have a choice. They drive him to the moors. The sky's grey, it's raining, light rain, and it's night time. Joe is dragged out of the boot and they batter him. They stamp on him with their fists and their feet. This isn't their first kidnapping. Joe keeps standing back up and getting kicked back down again. The group leave Joe on the moors. One of Joe's family calls the feds to say he's gone missing. Police arrive after a search and Joe is not responding. He has a bleed to the brain. They rush him to an ambulance and he's taken to hospital. He's in intensive care for 1 week. He's okay, but it could have a long-term effect. Meanwhile, the group get off in the car, smoking a spliff and blasting Meeks. They haven't really thought about what they've done. They're heading to burn out the car in a field somewhere near a car park. They know the ambulance turned up, but they don't know if Joe is alive. The randomers know that it's 50-50. One of the randomers was excluded in year 6 because at the time he just weren't listening to anybody. The randomers have been with the yacht before and they know that it doesn't always work. The yacht is just some meetings they go to. Prison doesn't really put them off. The randomers know that kids need to be given a chance. Not everyone gives them a chance. The randomers spoke about the support they received from the yacht once they got into trouble. They used to get helped out with things that they didn't know how to do. They were with them for 3 years. One of them had also done knife crime awareness 2 times in a row now. He didn't find it helpful because he breached before he finished. People speak to him about it, but it's just the mindset he's in.
Right, are we back?
You back.
Okay, thanks for that, Hannah. Just in the remaining time left, I'm just going to give a brief summary of the findings from the interviews with youth justice workers. Obviously, I can only scoot through these, and the full findings are in the report. So I would encourage you to have a look at the full report. I'm just going to briefly divide the findings up into the kind of 4 themes there: serious youth violence, ACEs, the relationship between the two, and then the implications of that for trauma-informed practice. I suppose it's important to firstly note that out of those 200 young people that were assessed using the ACEs tool, nearly half, 99 of them, had committed an SYV offence, predominantly robbery, then violence, then drugs. And this was reflected in the interviews with workers. I think it's actually important to note there that quote at the bottom that, you know, maybe 15 years ago, first-time entrants would be coming in with quite a minor offence, but since the Youth Justice Services contracted and those who are left in the system, so to speak, are more complex and maybe disadvantaged, we're now getting more first-time entrants coming through with SYV offences. And again, there's someone talking about a first-time offender coming through for kidnap. In terms of the reasons that the workers identified, they talked about territoriality, post-Cold rivalries in Manchester. There's a story there about a young person on a bus going through an area, obviously sitting on the top deck with his hood on because he knew he shouldn't be in there, but nonetheless, some people from the area got on the bus and stabbed him up. And again, there, as highlighted in the animation, that the young people and their stories that the young people created, for them, the robbery is more about gaining respect, getting a reputation amongst their peers, in as much as it is about financial gain. And again, also, practitioners talked about young people on their caseload having been victims of SYV, and that's the reason why they went and committed an offence. You'll see in the report there's a story of a young person who was stabbed outside his school, and it was filmed and it went onto social media. And rather than being scared, his main thought was one of anger, and he was immediately thinking about how he could get revenge on those people who had humiliated him and done that to him. Again, soberingly, 3/10 of the assessed children, 60 of them have been charged with possession of a knife or bladed article. And again, it's as it was highlighted in that animation. You've got children as young as 7 carrying a knife because they think everyone else is carrying a knife. They're scared of being humiliated, being assaulted, that being captured on social media and shared amongst their friends. And research that's been done recently, I think by Pete Traynor at the University of Leeds, has looked at the reasons for people carrying knives, and it is mainly, that fear of being attacked, and so they can defend themselves. And research has also found that actually that young people view it almost as irresponsible not to carry a knife. So they want to defend themselves. And importantly, I think there that a lot of the young people that the work has talked about don't see past just carrying that knife. They don't realise that actually carrying a knife makes it more likely that they're going to be a perpetrator or a victim of an SYV offence. They might get stopped by the police and searched, and then the knife's found on their person. And the work has also talked about children, those who've been exploited, being given drugs and a knife in case anything kind of goes wrong with the drug deal, and then being stopped by the police and having drugs and a weapon on them at the same time. So, yeah, they didn't really see past that thing of I need to carry a knife and somehow I'll be able to put someone off by just pulling the knife out. They couldn't see past that instance. In terms of the prevalence of ACEs, it was just touched on there in the animation. We had the 10 ACEs on that assessment tool. 2/3 of the sample had 5 or more. Over a fifth had 8 or more, and 3 children had all 10. And it's important to consider the cumulative effect of those ACEs. A study in 2010 in the US with over 100,000 high school pupils found that each additional ACE was significantly associated with an increased risk of violence perpetration. So, as the ACEs build up, there's this kind of cumulative effect of them. And again, I suppose it's something we need to bear in mind. A lot of the workers we interviewed talked about this, that, and they were worried about the fact that these ACEs that they identified were just the tip of the iceberg. And they were worried that, they were just, all they knew about was what the young person might disclose to them or other workers. And they were very mindful that there was a lot they didn't know about. And it's not just the prevalence of the ACEs, it's the lack of the positive influences. In the narrative interviews with children, when asked, can you identify positive influences? One child said, I don't think there has been one. When they were asked to identify or think about positive moments in their lives, one child there couldn't think of one. And one child just says, why do I have shit things happen to me every year? Can't I just have a good year where nothing happens? So there was the dearth of positive influences and moments alongside the prevalence of the ACEs. In terms of the types of ACEs, again, it was touched on in the animation there. The most commonly identified ACE was parental separation and loss. And then about 2/3 of the sample had emotional abuse, emotional neglect, substance misuse, and witnessing domestic violence or domestic violence in the household. When we start to look at the combinations of these ACEs, over half of the 200 children had experienced both emotional abuse and emotional neglect. 3/4, 150 of them, had experienced some form of abuse, predominantly emotional and physical, but also some reported sexual abuse. Nearly 3/4 had experienced some form of neglect, and shockingly 3/5 of the sample had experienced abuse and neglect together. And as we might expect, of those 130 children who had witnessed domestic violence in the household, nearly 2/3 of them had also been victims of physical abuse themselves. So these are the kind of things that were going on in the lives of the children in the system. Research has shown that actually, as Deborah talked about at the start, it has an impact on mental health and emotional well-being. The workers talked about children on their caseload struggling to handle their emotions, and how, because they're confused and they're struggling to handle their emotions, what they're feeling seems to be manifested mainly as anger and aggression as they kind of project their frustrations onto those around them. And again, there's a quote there at the bottom there from a child who was reflecting on his offence, his SYV offence, and he talked about actually having a very, very kind of bad week where his nan passed away and then he got convicted for his offence. And he really couldn't articulate why that was, but he said, yeah, he was just angry and losing his shit with everybody. When it came to domestic violence, research has shown that actually domestic violence can be socially learned, but the problem is that when you've got children who are witnessing this at home on a regular basis, then they take that as the way to respond to problems outside their household. And it was so common, apparently, that it was almost normalised amongst the children on the youth justice caseload. And it's important to talk about the impact of that domestic violence or living in a household that's characterised by violence, is that they made a lot of the children feel unsafe, and there was a kind of persistent threat surrounding the young people. A lot of neurodevelopmental research has highlighted that actually being in this kind of state of fear, being in the kind of permanent state of flight or fight, can have a long-term impact on a child's development, to the point where they're actually in that permanent state of arousal, even when there's no threat present. And again, this was highlighted in the animation there, where in one of the stories they talked about, there's no choice, it's fight or flight. And again, also, if violence has been dominant in your childhood, then it makes it a little bit more understandable why young people might feel the need to carry knives to protect themselves when they're then on the street and outside of the family home. And again, we're not saying there's a causal link between ACEs and SYV, but the fact is research has shown that ACEs are strongly associated with problematic behaviours like offending, substance use, etc. And the workers did talk about the fact that the children on their caseload, they seemed a bit more predisposed to be searching for belonging amongst their peers, amongst those outside of the family home, people who would give them respect, give them meaning, give them an identity. And this was particularly worrying when it comes to CCE, because unfortunately a lot of exploiters pick up on the vulnerability of these children, and they give them what they've always wanted. There's a story in the report around a young person just being given £20 by someone in their late 20s just to get some food, just to get some chips, and from that point on, the child thought, that person's great, they're there for me. But as that bottom quote highlights, where we identify CCE and we say exploitation, the vast majority of the children, talk about it being an opportunity for financial gain, for status, for reputation. So just finally, we're just going to look at the strengths of a trauma-informed approach. And again, this ties in very nicely with what the young people themselves said in the participatory workshops, in that they want people to understand their lives, their biographies. They want people to understand the reasons behind what they do or their behaviours. And as that bottom quote highlights, workers were aware that until you know what a child's actually been through, you can't really explain why they've done what they've done. And until you do that, you don't really know what needed to be put in place to actually reduce the risk of that child being involved in further offending or violence. Obviously, we know the need for delivering trauma-informed work, but it's not easy. There's lots of barriers to doing it. Research has shown that young people who've been subject to trauma have a distrust of adults. Young people don't like dwelling on things that upset them. They might want to present themselves as masculine and invulnerable. But as that top quote, that's from one of the children that was interviewed. He doesn't want to talk about the past. You just couldn't go there. And then, sadly, a lot of the children that were interviewed just couldn't see a link between ACEs and their offending behaviour, and that was primarily because they didn't think the trauma they'd lived through was an ACE. They just thought it was the norm. It was their life. It was how everyone lived, and so why would they expect anything differently? Potentially, the main barrier is the time it's taken to build that trusted relationship. Again, that was highlighted by Tom and highlighted by the animation, that there needs to be that trusted relationship between a child and their worker. But these things take time to build. Some of the workers talked about 3 months, some of them talked about 6 months. And obviously that sometimes clashed with the length of, of short orders that children were on. But particularly when it comes to discussing ACEs or disclosing ACEs, there needs to be that kind of awareness that actually the trusted relationship to discuss those kind of sensitive topics does take a long time to build. In terms of support and guidance, the final couple of slides here, all the workers have been given training around ACEs awareness training, and so they knew about ACEs, but they felt that what was lacking was some way of actually working in it, just taking it a step further, responding in a slightly more therapeutic way. A lot of the workers were worried that they were going to open a can of worms by discussing ACEs with the young person, and they didn't feel qualified or trained enough to actually kind of close that can. And so the young person or the child might leave in a worse place than when they came in. And so because of that, a lot of the workers that were interviewed said actually they would value some more therapeutic training around ACEs. So because they had the trusted relationship with the young person, the young person didn't want to speak to someone else, a stranger. They wanted to speak to their worker who they had the relationship with. The workers did feel there would be value in them having a little bit more therapeutic training around working through ACEs if a child is suddenly disclosed an ACE in a session. As touched on at the start, Manchester Youth Justice has commissioned 2 therapists from One Education as an emotional support team. I think they work 1 or 2 days a week within the Youth Justice team. And so if anyone's got significant trauma, if a child discloses something significant, then they tend to get referred to the therapists who offer them some sessions. But again, importantly here was the need to offer staff clinical supervision with those therapists. A lot of the workers talked about the stress and the anxiety and the worry of actually discussing ACEs with the children on their caseload. They found it hard to process what they'd been told. And so they really felt that if they were being expected or asked to work in a trauma-informed way, then they needed to have access to good quality clinical supervision to allow them to kind of work through their own trauma and debrief and think about some of the stories that they'd been told by the children. And then just the final point here is around some of the wider barriers to implementing trauma-informed practice. Again, a lot of the youth justice workers felt that they had a reasonably good understanding of trauma-informed practice, a good awareness of it and the impact it has. But they reported coming up against barriers with other agencies outside of the youth justice teams, particularly the courts and particularly the police. And as you see there, that middle quote, well, if a young person suffered multiple ACEs, then surely they're more risky, and that means they should go to prison. So it's kind of trying to tackle that lack of understanding. And as Hannah will touch on in a minute, it's one of our recommendations around the kind of systemic training around ACEs. And again, the final point is that, and this is something that came out of the recent report on the Enhanced Case Management project in Wales, that actually all agencies that work with young people should receive training around ACEs and a better understanding of ACEs, because, as the quote says, if everyone was trauma informed, it would make everything a lot easier. Sorry for the whistle-stop tour of those recommendations. As I said, I'd recommend everyone looks at the report to get the full findings. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to take 5 minutes to go through these recommendations now. So our recommendations have been developed looking at each aspect of the research project. And we start with supporting children to meaningfully participate. And Tom talked you through the underlying ethos of the work in the Manchester team and the participation and co-creation they do with children. We would recommend encouraging and supporting children to tell their stories and describe their experiences and opinions, which will in turn provide an opportunity for professionals to co-create personalised responses to youth violence. Obviously, we've spoken a great deal about ACEs today, and we've provided a lot of data about ACEs. One of the strong recommendations here is to avoid quantifying ACEs as a measure of risk. And we just saw that quote there from a police officer. It is potentially very dangerous ground. Quantifying ACEs, interpreting them as a measure of risk of becoming involved in violence, either as a perpetrator or a victim, is at odds with trauma-informed approaches to working with children. Instead, we need to be thinking about the advancement of high-quality trauma-informed policy and practice, relies on that identification of ACEs, which Paul has spoken about a great deal, and understanding the impact of those ACEs on individual children. We also need to recognise that children are actually traumatised by their involvement in serious violence. And this came out very, very strongly in the workshops with children who'd been perpetrators of really quite serious violent offences were traumatised by their involvement. So youth justice workers need to recognise that children can be traumatised by their involvement. This secondary trauma needs to be acknowledged as an ACE, as an adverse childhood experience. And again, personalised approaches co-designed with children to ensure that that secondary trauma is addressed. We also recommend delivering training around implementing trauma-informed practice. And what you'll have seen as Paul was going through the findings with youth justice professionals, they all said that they had received general training on ACEs and trauma-informed approaches, but what they felt was lacking was more specific training on how to implement trauma-informed practice in a more therapeutic way. And we would go one step further and to say that this training to address this need should be provided by qualified professionals, going back to some of what Deborah said right at the beginning of the presentation and the need for professionals to deliver the training. We also recommend that clinical support is provided to children who need it. This support around trauma should be readily available to children. The responsibility for the delivery of the support shouldn't just lie solely with youth justice professionals. This is the potential to be harmful to them and to children. Manchester, as we've spoken about today, does commission services that are delivered by the drama therapists who we worked with, and we recommend that this clinical support should be delivered by qualified professionals based within youth justice services. And actually health services perhaps should be committed to the commissioning of some of this support alongside youth justice services. Sorry, I'm just having to, so I can see what I'm doing here, just change the angle of my camera. Offering clinical supervision to youth justice workers as well. Now, this is to protect workers from vicarious trauma. And they should be offered clinical supervision with a qualified professional, should be made available to all youth justice workers who are expected to work in trauma-informed ways. And this should be in addition to any other existing supervision procedures. I've seen in the chat, and it's something that Paul also spoke about, this training shouldn't just be for youth justice professionals. In the chat, we've got things in there about schools. We've noted the police. We actually suggest that training should be given at very early stages. So teachers, for example, in the teaching profession, healthcare providers, and to each part of the youth justice system. Because what will happen if not is that children will continue to fall through the cracks. And by the time they come to the youth justice system, it's again for youth justice teams to deal with everything that the child has experienced. If there was a more kind of comprehensive way of looking at this, training needs and who can develop trauma-informed practice, we may find that build-up of trauma and the therapy that is needed is actually tackled much earlier in a child's life. And sorry, my 10-year-old's just walked in as I'm trying to do this, trying to show me loads of pieces of paper. Just so those are our recommendations, and I think you will have seen where we were coming from with most of those as we've gone through the report. This has really got to be based on understanding the children. And again, I noticed in the chat people saying, you know, what happens if a child doesn't want to kind of engage? What if they don't want to do any of this work? And what we found since working with the Manchester Youth Justice Services over, a number of years now, is that the best work is relational. And the work that that Manchester do with their children is all underpinned by relationships. And the recommendations, I think, really point to those relationships, the development of this sort of work, but also, I guess, making sure that children and professionals are safe, so to speak, in the work that they are being asked to carry out in terms of trauma-informed practices. So, Paul, if it's okay, I think I'll leave it there because it's 1:15 and I know that we do want to take some time for questions.
Yes.
So are we going to go straight to questions now?
If that's okay, I'll take over then, Hannah, and
okay.
Bring in some questions. And there is one already in the chat, which I think is probably better for a discussion. And it is, if I can find it now, it is from Kathy Hampson. Sorry, Kathy, I'm speaking on your behalf, but it is, has there been any consideration of the negative and potentially deficit focus of the ACE model in the research? I'm not sure who would like to answer that.
Ooh. Yeah, I can. Sorry, Maria, I'm just trying to juggle with the tech here. Yeah, I can come in on that. I mean, I mean, the ACEs model does have a lot of its negatives. Even the tool itself that we use, that 10-point tool, has its critics. Some people have said actually we should, broaden the tool to include 14 things. Some think we should do away with it altogether. And yeah, I mean, Kathy makes a good point there about the kind of backward-looking deficit model of identifying ACEs, but we're not trying to, and I don't know if this will answer your question, Kathy, we're not trying to kind of identify causality there. We're trying to say, actually, this is a group that has these needs, it's been through these experiences, and actually, if it can work with people in trusted relationships that are, like Tom said, more forward-looking, to help to develop the ambitions of young people, then hopefully we can change children and young people's lives for the better. So, yeah, by no means are we saying actually that it's a deficit model. If anything, it's I suppose a more nuanced, forward-looking, supportive model. I don't know if I've answered your question there, Kathy. Sorry.
I think, can I come in, Paul, a sec?
Yeah.
It's based on the PYP principles that is less around what's wrong with you to more of what's happened to you. And so this is just, all it does is give you an indication of presenting need. It's not about quantifying or using it as a measure of risk, like Hannah makes in the recommendations. But I understand where you're coming from. We don't want to get back into quantifying young people around risk and danger. So, but yeah, that's not what we were trying to do.
And can I just come in there? I think also we've learned in Manchester the skill of articulating a child's lived experiences to the courts, and we're seeing a lot better outcomes for children presenting with serious youth violence and other offences in court when we can explain what this child has been through. And I say better outcomes, I mean not going to custody. We'll be keeping kids in the community because we can articulate why we've seen the presented behaviours, but we can also, with our therapeutic intervention, creative interventions, we can also sell to the court with credibility a viable community package.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to open to the audience for questions. Any further questions? Oh, there's some hands up. Apologies. I can't see the name, so I'm just going to. No, sorry, I can't work out who that is because there's so many in the call. Do you just want to come forward if you've asked a question. Let's hope we can do it one at a time.
Marie, Michelle.
Yes.
Michelle from Manchester. Just on the back of what's just been said about the ACEs toolkit, just in case anybody's not clear, it's not something that you would take into a session with a child or the family and like a checklist of have you ever been abused. It's not something, it's kind of done behind the scenes as part of your assessment. Just when someone was mentioned about the deficits and being quite negative, because that obviously could be a trigger.
That's a really good point, Michelle. Yes, we're a bit more discreet than that, and we would never do that. Thank you. Anybody else want to come forward? Well, I'm going to fill the gap then. I'm going to ask a question because I don't see any hands at the moment. You haven't mentioned anything about race in terms of being an influencing factor. And we know levels of disproportionality of Black and mixed heritage boys, mainly in Manchester, in the youth justice caseload. What was your finding around race? How relevant was that to what you found?
I mean, I know that I've got colleagues who want to say something, so I'll just quickly come in first. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the most important thing, firstly, is that when we had the ACEs tool completed, we did some cross tabulations to look if there's any relationships between ethnicity and SYV, types of ACEs, carrying a knife, etc. And there were no significant relationships there in terms of particular groups having a predisposition for any type of offence or type of ACE. But we were mindful that in the workshops we tried to have a more representative group of children, and as people will see from the report when they look at the kind of demographics that are presented in there, I think we did that in terms of working with a whole range of young people in Manchester.
I mean, it's just very quickly. It's something in the report that we also write about in the next steps, not just for the research in Manchester, but the next steps looking at ethnicity and SYV. And we write about this in the sense of obviously the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, some of the work that's come out very recently to say that BAME children, and I use the term BAME because that's what's in that's how the figures are reported, more than twice as likely to live in poverty than those from a white family. School exclusion rates are, I'm just looking, 6 times higher than those of the white peers. So it might be less about BAME children being involved in violence, but looking at those, I guess, looking at those experiences that they have as children, as we were talking about in the presentation, much earlier in their lives than when they reach the youth justice teams. You know, living in poverty, school exclusions, then leading to BAME children, you know, making up half of all children in custody. So I think there's some real much needed work to be done that perhaps isn't solely about violence. It's the experiences of BAME children as they go through the different systems in their life, from education, health, and you know, when they may end up in the youth justice system.
Yeah, and I think it's worthwhile adding there, sorry Marie, that I've just seen a comment from Amy in the chat around, you know, future research around females and SYV. And Deb, do you just want to just talk briefly about the work you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, very briefly. I'm leading a huge 5-year study at the moment into the impact of ACEs mental health on CCE and CSE in Greater Manchester. And we're already getting preliminary data to suggest that there's a relationship between sexual exploitation in early childhood and prevalence to be exploited into CSE at older ages, and impacts around anxiety and depression. So yeah, that should be coming out in the next year or so. And I thought that why I mentioned it earlier is a lot of the youth justice cohorts are predominantly male, as we know. I think we're missing a trick here by not looking at that in the more kind of female populations, because they don't necessarily come into the youth justice population as much, but more so now with CSE and CCE. So more research is going to come out in the next year or so about that. Yeah.
Can I just very quickly add to that, Deb? Also in the report, we do talk about gender, and that the need to focus on gender is perhaps different to the focus that we have on boys involved in violence, and that as just to kind of re-emphasize what Deborah was saying there, just that girls are not always involved in not always, I know sometimes they are involved in the physical act of the violence, but they do a lot of the labour afterwards in terms of the support that they provide to their male peers, to boyfriends, to siblings, you know, so they are experiencing trauma in a different way. They can also be witnessing some of the violence, but it's not necessarily them as a victim. So there is definitely a need to have a project that focuses on girls.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for that. Tricia, you had a question. I think you've put it in the chat, but maybe you'd articulate it for us.
It was just the continuation of the discussion around BME young people and whether their experiences of racism and discrimination should be identified as an ACE when we're kind of doing the trauma-informed work, whether we should be picking that up as well.
Tricia, we did actually discuss this as part of the report, and we were quite keen that did go in as an ACE, and I think it's something that in discussion with yourselves, I know that you're also in the Manchester team, I think it's something that we need to discuss and perhaps add that, because I absolutely agree with where you're coming from here. Yeah, it was certainly something that that we have discussed at length, and I'd be very happy, I think, well, we'd all be happy actually if you wanted to pick up this discussion you know, in a smaller meeting.
Yeah, and just further to that, Hannah, you know, a lot of the workers we interviewed talked about the fact that disadvantage and deprivation should be considered an ACE as well. Yeah. In terms of the, you know, the context of all of this. So yes.
I think maybe one of the key words here is intersectionality, because these ACEs very rarely stand alone as one thing that a child is experiencing. You know, so Paul talked there about deprivation. I read out the stats on, you know, the numbers of BAME children who live in poverty compared with those to their white peers. So all these, I think the thing is that, again, not just to see a child experiences this thing. A child experiences a lot of these things, and they are all interconnected in some ways. So yeah, very, very happy and open to discussing it further, Tricia.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments?
Marie, there's a really good question about the methods actually by Lindsay Thurston in the chat that I'd like to pick up.
I cannot keep up with the chat, Deborah, so please go ahead.
Lindsay asked, what was our rationale for using the McAdams life story interview, because she's used it with young adults in prison and found it really rewarding and therapeutic. The project team here, we used it based on the research that we've been doing in Oldham with the girls that I mentioned earlier in Greater Manchester, because it's a really nice way that adapts the PYP approach that we use here, that allows young people to take ownership of their narrative and their story, which is about this idea of co-production and co-creation, as opposed to the more rigid, semi-structured interviews. We felt it was fitting or in keeping more with what we're about here in Manchester. Paul, do you want to add anything to that in terms of the methodology of the project? Or
no, it was just a case of, obviously, because we're looking at, you know, children's lives, you know, we wanted to have a tool that captured the kind of the biography, the lived experience of children. So we wanted some kind of biographical narrative tool. Yeah, and as Deb said there, you know, the experience of using McAdams with the Oldham Getting Out for Good study made it seem like an ideal fit for this study.
We have Susan Scott's got her hand up. Hello, Susan.
Hiya. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, was there any consideration about support for parents or carers? Either for parents, obviously there's lots of parents that have had very similar trauma experiences in their own lives and maybe struggled to parent, or, you know, got a young person that's been traumatized is actually coming home and still living in the same address. I just wondered if there's any consideration around how you'd work with them.
Who would like to come forward to answer that?
Sorry, Hannah.
No, Paul, carry on. Sorry.
I'm just trying to juggle with seeing chats and pictures, and yeah, I fully support the claim there, but it was something that we didn't consider in this study, I'm afraid. But I think it's definitely something that needs to be investigated further in the future.
Susan, I would say to you that, you know, the focus of the research was very much about the children and the young people, but you know as well as I know that any work that you do with a young person, you need to think about the impact of that on the family and the impact of the family on that child as well. You can't do it in isolation, so it makes really good sense to be working with the family alongside the young person. I don't know if Tom would agree or disagree.
I completely agree. I think you know, we're Manchester, part of our development as a service, we're looking at a whole family approach, and trying to work with siblings, or trying to get a young person we're working with to work with siblings and to work with parents. Is there enough with working with parents? I'd have to say no. I'd say we're not there yet as a society. Never mind as a service. But I do think Gareth Nixon's team, who's on the call, who run the public health in Manchester, who are running the trauma-informed practice, are really working hard across the city to work with schools, to work with communities around trauma-responsive approaches. But Manchester's a big place, but I know he's done some great work, and especially in the Wythenshawe area. There's been some great work done with parents around the trauma response toolkit. So, yeah.
Just sorry, Tom. Just one. I've just seen a question from Amy again ping up in the chat, and it was something that was touched on a lot in the interviews. Amy's question is: were there any barriers around young people with unidentified speech and language needs and their ability to understand, explain their lived experience? Yeah, I mean, a number of the work has actually said that by working with, you know, the therapist, the speech and language therapist, it enabled young people to start to articulate their lived experiences better. The therapists that were commissioned by the Youth Justice Service also, I mean, they're creative therapists, so they use a range of creative methods, of which drama is just one, art-based, other creative methods to try and help people who might have unidentified speech and language needs or just can't verbalize that they're racist, to try and disclose them in more creative ways. But yeah, that was something definitely was highlighted.
Mm-hmm. Just to carry on what Paul said there very quickly about the workshops, we well, in any research that we do with the Youth Justice team, is we always ask if there are any kind of speech and language difficulties. We were told that there were a couple of young people in the workshops who did have kind of speech language needs. So working with the drama therapists, what I didn't have a chance to say when I was presenting is that one of the drama therapists, who I know is actually here today because I've seen her in the chat, was drawing, was literally drawing at the same time that the children were doing the storytelling. So for those children who perhaps were either, I don't know, too shy or perhaps didn't want to speak, everything was being drawn out. So and they did have the opportunity to draw themselves. I have to say none of the children took that up, but you know, I wouldn't draw in front of other people either unless I was particularly talented. But you know, we did think about all of these different needs that the children had, and we were very careful with the language that we used, and you know, repeating things, particularly not using academic jargon, not using jargon at all, but without condescending the children, kind of, you know, not pretending that we were 14, 15, 16 and trying to kind of use language that we wouldn't have used ordinarily. So, you know, I think the visual ways of working also were really effective in this research, but a really good question.
And yeah, and also the sport-based interventions really worked. I saw Deirdre put up The Body Keeps the Score, the Van der Kolk trauma-based research, the book that is written, and we really use that in those workshops as well, the more kind of somatic experience and communication, not just practitioners stood up trying to extract stories of trauma from people. We were very, very mindful that we incorporated all the different kind of clinical and, you know, youth work-based methods to try and work with these young people in the best way we could.
There's a question that's just come up. Has the research been shared with social care agencies? And I can answer that. The answer is no, because the research has just been published today. It's just come out. So you're the first to hear about it and to get the reports. But obviously there is a plan for it to be shared widely with partners, stakeholders, our colleagues in children's services, and our MMU colleagues are going to work with us to make sure that these messages are disseminated widely, both here in Manchester and in Greater Manchester. We're very keen that the research is as useful as possible to as many people as needed.
And like I said at the start, Maria, I've emailed the report, the PDF of the report, to the YJB so they can hopefully disseminate it out to all attendees, so people can get a hold of it themselves.
Great. I think we've slightly run over time. So there are loads of things going on in the chat. As I said, I cannot keep up with it, but I will have a look at it when we finish the meeting. But I think all there is to say is for me to say thank you to Paul, to Hannah, Deborah and Tom, and to the drama therapists for their work on this research project. I'm absolutely delighted with the findings, and I know that it's going to be really helpful to us in our work in Manchester, and I hope it is to other people who've joined in today. So thank you for signing up for this. I hope you got value from it. We certainly have. Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks, Marie, and everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.